Imagine pouring millions into lakeside cabins, only to watch them sink into mud before the first guests ever arrived. That's what happened when Corinna Duval met the one man who refused to let greed rule his land. Picture this: 139 vacation cabins standing proud along a lake in eastern Tennessee. Their wood still smelled fresh. Their decks stretched right over the water, and glossy brochures promised city visitors a perfect escape in nature. But within weeks of their completion, they were sinking, cracking, leaning, swallowed by mud and silence. It didn't happen slowly. It happened in a rush, as if the land had finally decided to push back. People in town whispered about greed, about arrogance, and about one man who had finally done what no one else had the courage to do. His name was Raymond Holt, a 62-year-old retired park ranger with calloused hands and eyes that carried decades of watching forests grow and rivers shift. And the woman whose dream was crumbling into the earth? Corinna Duval, the developer who promised prosperity but ignored every warning that stood in her way. The story of how these cabins came to ruin isn't just about business gone wrong. It's about heritage colliding with ambition, about a landowner who understood the lake better than anyone, and about a decision that changed everything in a single afternoon. Corinna first arrived in Jefferson County 2 years earlier with investors from Nashville and Chattanooga, driving a polished black SUV that looked almost alien against the two-lane roads and weathered barns. She talked fast, moved fast, and smiled in a way that told you she was used to getting what she wanted. "This lake," she said during her first meeting at the community center, "is untapped potential. Families will come here, couples will come here, money will flow through this town like never before." The locals clapped politely, but their eyes drifted toward Raymond, who sat near the back with his arms crossed. The dam was his. The water was his family's responsibility. And every log and stone in that structure had been placed with patience. He stood up quietly and said, "You're talking about potential, Miss Duval, but you don't know this water. You don't know what it takes to keep it steady." Corinna's smile never faltered. "With respect, Mr. Holt, progress can't be stopped. This is the future." That word, progress, hung in the air like a challenge. To Corinna, it meant cabins, profits, and headlines. To Raymond, it meant collapse because he had watched too many developers treat the land as if it were an empty canvas. The truth was, the lake wasn't stable. Its edges were marshland, spongy and unpredictable. You could plant cattails there, maybe a fishing dock, but not rows of heavy cabins pressed shoulder to shoulder. Still, construction began. Bulldozers arrived, and the roar of machinery carried across the valley. Each week, new frames rose, identical and lifeless, their stilts sunk into ground that Raymond knew would never hold. He walked the shoreline, muttering to himself, remembering his father's words. The lake gives, but it also takes. At night, he sat on his porch staring at the waterline. He knew the dam better than anyone, how much pressure it could bear, how much release it needed during the rainy season. Every warning he gave Corinna was brushed aside. Every letter ignored. Every phone call cut short. One evening, after his final attempt to reason with her, she said over the phone, "Mr. Holt, I respect your passion, but business is business. We'll manage the risk." He hung up without answering because deep down he knew what she didn't. You can't manage nature. You respect it, or it reminds you who is in charge. Weeks later, as the cabins neared completion, something shifted in Raymond. He wasn't a reckless man. He wasn't bitter for the sake of bitterness, but he was tired. Tired of warnings dismissed, tired of seeing balance traded for greed. He began to imagine what would happen if the dam were opened. He didn't see destruction. He saw restoration. He saw the lake dropping back to its natural level, the marsh reclaiming its place, the birds returning to the mud flats where they had once nested. And so, as the town whispered and the cabins shone with their hollow newness, Raymond's choice began to form like a storm on the horizon. But before we reach the day the gates opened, you need to understand who Raymond was and why the lake meant more to him than money ever could. Raymond Holt was the kind of man you noticed not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself with a quiet weight. At 62, his shoulders were broad but slightly bent from years of work, and his hands bore permanent marks from handling tools, ropes, and axes. Locals in Jefferson County often joked that he looked more like part of the landscape than a resident of it. He had spent nearly 40 years as a park ranger most of them in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, patrolling trails, guiding lost hikers, and keeping an eye on the changing woods. For him, the job had never been about a paycheck. It was about stewardship, about watching over something older and greater than himself. When he retired, the land didn't let him go. He returned to his family's property near Cherokee Lake, where a modest stone dam built by his grandfather in the late 1930s still held back the waters. That dam wasn't grand by any means, no towering concrete wall, no massive turbines, just carefully stacked stone, steel reinforcements added in the 1970s, and a set of gates that required patient maintenance. But in Raymond's eyes, it was as important as any monument. It was the reason his family's farm had survived droughts, the reason fish stocked by the state had flourished, and the reason migratory birds had returned every spring. Neighbors often saw him out there at dawn, leaning on the railing, coffee mug steaming in the cool air as he checked the water level against the old markers scratched into the rock. He could read the lake like other men read books. A dip in the reeds told him the water had dropped overnight. A cluster of herons at the inlet told him the fish were moving upstream. Every detail mattered. His wife, Lorna, used to tease him, "You talk about that lake like it's a person." And Raymond would shrug, answering, "That's because it is. It breathes, it shifts, it remembers." Lorna had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving him in the small cabin they had shared. The silence weighed on him at first, but the lake gave him purpose. He mended nets, planted trees along the shore, and mentored local kids who wanted to learn about fishing and conservation. One boy, Travis Nunn, followed him around like a shadow each summer. "Why do you care so much about mud and water?" Travis once asked. Raymond chuckled and said, "Because if you don't care, someone else will sell it off piece by piece." That belief put him directly in Corinna Duval's path. The place was busier than usual, and all anyone wanted to talk about was the new cabins. Across the room, Jeff McCormick raised his voice, tired of keeping it bottled in. "Look, y'all can complain all you want, but my cousin's working construction over there and making more than he's ever earned. Tell me how that's bad for this town." A woman near the counter snapped back, "Because when the lake goes, Jeff, so does your cousin's job." "Then what?" Jeff shook his head. "Always the same argument, always doomsday. Maybe, just maybe, this time things work out." All eyes turned to Raymond. He didn't ask for it, but his silence carried weight. After a long sip of coffee, he finally spoke. "The lake won't hold. You're betting your future on mud." The diner quieted for a moment. Then Corinna herself walked in, heels clicking against the floor. She'd made it a habit to stop by, smiling, shaking hands, keeping herself visible. Tonight was no different. She walked straight over to Raymond's booth. "Mr. Holt," she said brightly, though her eyes were sharp, "you'll have to forgive the noise out there. Progress isn't always gentle." He looked up at her slowly. "Noise ain't the problem, Miss Duval. Balance is. You're tipping the scale, and when it falls, don't say you weren't warned." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Corinna smiled tightly. "Balance," she repeated. "That's a word I respect, which is why my team has taken every precaution. These cabins will stand longer than you think." Some clapped at her words. Others exchanged skeptical looks. Raymond only leaned back in his seat, unconvinced. But the tension didn't stay confined to diners or county meetings, it seeped into homes. Families who'd lived side by side for generations now sat on opposite sides of the argument. Take the Harts, for example. Frank Hart was a retired schoolteacher, always pragmatic. His wife, June, ran the local quilting circle for decades. They'd been the kind of couple who volunteered at bake sales and organized food drives, but when it came to the cabins, they couldn't agree. One night in their kitchen, June slammed a dish towel on the counter. "Frank, I don't understand how you can't see what's happening. You've fished those waters since you were a boy. You know how soft that ground is." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "And I also know our grandson needs work. He's out there with the crew now, earning honest money. You want me to tell him to quit because maybe the cabin sinks someday?" June's voice broke. "It's not someday, it's soon. And when it happens, what will you tell him then?" That kind of argument played out all across the county. Hope against fear, profit against preservation. Even church sermons couldn't avoid it. Pastor Clay at First Baptist tried one Sunday. "The good book says the wise man builds his house upon rock. What happens when you build upon sand?" The congregation exchanged glances, everyone catching the reference. Meanwhile, Raymond carried himself the same as always, steady, deliberate, but quieter now. He'd already spoken his piece more times than he could count. The cabins kept rising anyway, yet the unease in the community only made his warnings sharper in people's minds. Some called him stubborn. Others called him prophetic. By September, the first brochures for lakeshore cabins at Cherokee were circulating. Glossy pictures showed smiling families grilling on the decks, kayaks gliding across still water, children fishing off the docks. The photos looked like paradise. Locals knew better. The cabins in the pictures hadn't been there a year. They hadn't faced a single hard winter or spring flood. But the investors didn't care. Reservations were already being booked. At the post office, neighbors stood in line clutching bills and catalogs, talking in low voices about the pictures. One man muttered, "Looks like they built Disney World out there." Another answered, "Looks like they built it on quicksand." Raymond, standing behind them, didn't interrupt. He didn't need to, they already knew where he stood. But the strain wasn't just on the community anymore, it was on the lake itself. And signs of collapse were beginning to show in ways no one could ignore. It was only one cabin, but it was enough to confirm what Raymond had been saying for months. For Raymond, one cabin collapsing wasn't the disaster, it was the warning. And he knew the only way to save the lake was a decision no one else would dare to make. By late September, the lake was beginning to look sick. To someone passing through, it might have seemed the same calm blue framed by cabins gleaming in the sun, but those who lived nearby knew something was off. The waterline dipped lower than usual. Algae spread faster along the shore. Dead fish appeared in clusters, their silver bodies floating near the boat ramps. Raymond noticed every sign. He had spent a lifetime reading water, and nothing about what he was seeing felt normal. One evening, he brought his old pickup to the far edge of the cabins where the crews had just finished laying sod. A few workers were still there, tossing cigarette butts in the dirt as they loaded tools into their truck. Raymond stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the shoreline. The mud was cracking, breaking apart in wide veins that stretched toward the cabin's stilts. "Mr. Holt," one of the workers called, smirking. "You here to give us another warning?" Raymond ignored the sarcasm. He bent down, scooped a handful of mud, and squeezed. Water oozed between his fingers. Then the soil collapsed into sludge. "Tell your boss this ground won't last a season," he said evenly. The worker laughed, shaking his head. "That's above my pay grade," but Raymond wasn't laughing. He left the site and drove straight to Corinna's office trailer. She was inside going over contracts with two investors, both dressed in city suits. The moment she saw him, she sighed. "Mr. Holt, I can't imagine what brings you here this late." Raymond stepped inside, boots still muddy. "You're killing the lake. The fish are already dying. The water's dropping faster than I've ever seen. If you don't stop now, it won't just be cabins falling. It'll be lawsuits and lives ruined." One of the investors frowned, shifting in his chair. "Is that true?" Corinna's jaw tightened, but her smile remained. "With respect, Mr. Holt exaggerates. He's always been opposed to this project. Nature shifts, yes, but our structures are built to adapt." Raymond's voice rose for the first time. "You can't adapt against nature. You don't control it, you respect it." The room fell silent. Even the investors looked unsettled. Corinna, however, didn't flinch. She gathered her papers, stood, and said, "Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Mr. Holt has strong feelings, but feelings don't build communities. Progress does. I'll see you both tomorrow." The investors left without a word, and Corinna turned on Raymond the moment the door closed. "Do you realize what you just did? You embarrassed me in front of men who've poured money into this project." Raymond stared at her, his voice low and steady again. "No, Corinna. You embarrassed yourself by building where you shouldn't, and the lake is already proving me right." For the first time, her smile cracked just slightly. Then she straightened her blazer, brushing off her sleeves. "If you think I'll let one stubborn man ruin what I've built, you're mistaken. Get out." He left without another word, but something inside him shifted that night. He had spent months warning her, warning the community, warning anyone who would listen. No one cared enough to stop it. Now the lake was giving signs of collapse, and he knew what would come next. 2 days later, rain poured across the county. A heavy autumn storm that lasted nearly 20 hours. Raymond stood at the dam in his raincoat, water slamming against the gates, mud churning along the shoreline. By dawn, several cabin decks were already tilting, their stilts sinking into the softened ground. One of the property managers called Corinna in a panic, saying, We've got water pooling under 6 cabins, the ground's turning to soup. Corinna drove out immediately, splashing mud across her tires, investors calling her phone nonstop. When she arrived, workers were shoving sandbags under the foundations, their boots sinking ankle-deep with every step. She barked orders, tried to stay composed, but the fear in her eyes was clear. Raymond was there too, standing at a distance, arms folded. Corinna spotted him and stormed over. "Are you enjoying this, watching us struggle?" He shook his head. "No, I warned you. I begged you to listen. Now the lake's showing you what happens when you push too far." She clenched her fists. "This is just a setback. We'll reinforce. We'll stabilize." Raymond's gaze hardened. "You can't reinforce against greed. You can't stabilize against arrogance. The ground doesn't care about your profits." Their argument was cut short by a crack, loud, sharp, unmistakable. Everyone turned as one of the cabins shifted violently, its stilts snapping under the weight. The structure sagged, half of it plunging into the mud with a groan of splintering wood. Workers shouted, pulling back. Corinna froze, her mouth open. The night after the storm, Raymond couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain still echoed in his ears, even though the skies had cleared. He sat at his kitchen table with a lamp burning low, staring at a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. Outside, the frogs had returned to the shallow pools along the marsh, croaking as if nothing unusual had happened. But Raymond knew better. He kept seeing that cabin collapse in his mind, timbers snapping, mud swallowing the stilts. To Corinna, it was just one unlucky unit. To him, it was proof that the balance had already tipped. The lake wasn't holding anymore, and if the cabin stayed, if the pressure on the shoreline continued, the collapse wouldn't stop at one. He reached into an old cigar box on the counter, pulling out a stack of photographs. His father standing at the dam in the 1960s, hand on the steel crank. His grandfather, shirtless, knee-deep in the water, placing the stones that would form the base wall. In every picture, the message was the same. The dam wasn't just a structure. It was responsibility. His family hadn't built it to make money. They built it to keep the land alive. The memories pulled him deeper. He could still hear his father's voice gravely with age. "Don't give the lake too much. Don't take too much from it. Keep it steady. Balance is everything." That voice followed him the next morning as he walked into town. He stopped at the Rusty Lantern, where only a few locals sat drinking coffee. Travis and Gwen, now 19 and working part-time at the hardware store, were behind the counter. Travis looked up, grinning. "Morning, Ray. You hear about the cabin that sank? Guess you were right all along." Raymond didn't smile. "Being right doesn't feel good when the land's breaking, Travis." Travis poured him a coffee and leaned close. "So what now? You gonna take him to court?" Raymond shook his head. "Courts don't move fast enough. Nature doesn't wait for hearings." Travis frowned, unsure what Raymond meant, but Raymond left without explaining. That afternoon, he visited his neighbor, Earl Mathis. Earl was stacking firewood, sweat darkening his shirt. Raymond leaned against the fence. "Earl, you saw it. The cabins are already sinking." Earl wiped his brow. "Yeah, hard to watch. But Corinna says they're reinforcing. She's got crews pouring concrete under the worst spots." "That's like patching a sinking boat with duct tape," Raymond replied. Earl hesitated. "Ray, what are you thinking?" Raymond looked him in the eye. "I'm thinking about balance and about how my family built that dam for the land, not for someone else's profit." Earl's face fell. "Ray, you wouldn't?" Raymond didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward his truck, leaving Earl with a knot in his stomach. That evening, Raymond returned to the dam. The sun dipped low, painting the water orange. He stood at the gate, his hands resting on the iron crank. He knew what it meant to turn it. He knew the lawsuits, the accusations, the headlines. People would call him reckless, destructive, maybe even criminal. But when he looked at the marsh beyond the cabins, the reeds gasping for space, the birds that hadn't returned, he felt clarity instead of doubt. He whispered out loud as if speaking to his father, "If I keep it closed, the lake dies. If I open it, the land lives." The weight of that choice pressed on him. He pictured Corinna's face, smug in her office trailer, dismissing his warnings. He pictured the townsfolk torn between jobs and heritage. And then he pictured the lake as it used to be, before cabins, before investors, before anyone thought money mattered more than balance. As darkness fell, Raymond sat on the dam's railing, still undecided. He didn't take action that night, but the choice had settled inside him like a seed waiting. The next day, Corinna held another press event near the cabins. Reporters from Knoxville had come to cover the challenges of the development. Standing before microphones, Corinna spoke with her usual poise. Setbacks are part of any project. We're addressing the issues head-on. These cabins are here to stay. Raymond watched from the edge of the crowd, his jaw tight. When Corinna finished, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "The land will decide if they stay." The reporters turned, cameras flashing. Corinna glared, but she didn't answer. She couldn't, not in front of the press. That night, Raymond returned to the dam again. The moon was high, casting silver across the water. He placed his hands on the crank and closed his eyes. He thought of his grandfather, his father, his late wife, and every warning he had ever given. The decision no longer felt like a choice, it felt like duty. But before he pulled that lever, before the lake drained, the final storm of confrontation with Corinna was yet to come. The confrontation came sooner than Raymond expected. Word had gotten around that he'd been seen spending more and more time at the dam, standing there long after dark as if waiting for something. Corinna heard the rumors and drove out herself one afternoon, her black SUV crunching along the gravel road that led to the water's edge. Raymond was there, of course, he always was, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the lake. The surface was calm, almost too calm, reflecting the cabins like a mirror. Corinna stepped out, heels sinking slightly into the gravel. "Mr. Holt," she called, her voice clipped. "We need to talk." Raymond didn't turn. "Talking's all we've done, Miss Duval. Talking while you build and the land sinks." She walked closer, folding her arms. "You've been spreading rumors. People are saying you plan to sabotage this project. I won't have it." Finally, he faced her. His eyes were steady, his voice low. "Not sabotage, correction." Corinna stiffened. "Do you realize what you're saying? If you touch that dam, you'll destroy millions of dollars in investment. You'll destroy jobs, futures. This entire county could collapse economically." Raymond's expression didn't change. "You already destroyed the lake. Futures built on mud don't last." For a moment, their words hung in the air. The only sound was the creak of the dam and the faint slap of water against the stones. Then Corinna stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you do this, you won't just be the stubborn old ranger. You'll be a criminal. You'll go to jail." Raymond leaned in slightly, his words sharp. "Then let them jail me. I'd rather sit in a cell knowing the lake will breathe again than sit on my porch watching you kill it piece by piece." They locked eyes. Corinna's composure faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered. She turned on her heel, storming back to her SUV. The tires spit gravel as she drove away. Raymond stood there long after she left, the weight of his decision pressing heavier than ever. He could hear his father's voice again echoing from memory. "Balance, Ray. Don't give too much. Don't take too much." By nightfall, the valley was silent. The cabin stood dark, only a few lanterns glowing from the work crew's trailers. Raymond walked slowly toward the crank, lantern in hand. His boots scraped against the old concrete. He placed the lantern on the railing and gripped the iron wheel with both hands. It resisted at first, the metal hadn't been turned that far in years. His muscles strained, his breath came heavy, but inch by inch the gate began to move. The first groan of rushing water echoed under his feet, low and rumbling, like the awakening of something ancient. Then it came, a surge of release as the lake began to drain. The current rushed through the opened gate, pulling weeds, branches, and mud with it. The surface rippled wildly, no longer a mirror but a restless churn. Raymond kept turning, sweat rolling down his temples. The sound grew louder, water pouring through the dam in torrents echoing down the valley. He stopped only when the gate was fully open, the lake now surrendering itself to gravity. He stepped back, lantern flickering, and watched as the shoreline pulled away from the cabins. Within hours, the water level dropped several feet. Decks that had once skimmed the surface now hung above patches of mud. By morning, the marshland had begun to reappear, sucking at the pilings one by one. The cabins tilted, their supports cracking under the shifting earth. At sunrise, workers arrived in shock. Shouts rang out across the site. "The lake's gone," one cried. Another stumbled through ankle-deep muck, cursing as his boots stuck. Phones lit up as calls were made, voices panicked. Corinna arrived within an hour, eyes blazing, her SUV skidding to a stop. She stormed toward Raymond, who stood calmly on the dam, watching. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice breaking. He didn't flinch. "I gave it back." Cabin after cabin groaned and sagged, wood splintering as mud claimed what had been forced upon it. To the investors, it was ruin. To Raymond, it was restoration. The lake was returning to what it had always been, free from the weight of concrete and profit. Corinna stared in disbelief, her face pale. Around her, workers argued, some angry, some awed. The town would soon be divided even further between those who saw Raymond as a criminal and those who saw him as the only man brave enough to put things right. But as the cabins fell, the true collapse wasn't just in wood and mud, it was in trust, in livelihoods, and in the fragile ties holding the community together. By the end of that week, Jefferson County was a storm without rain. Everyone was talking, at church, in the aisles of the grocery store, on porches late into the night. Word of the drained lake and the collapsing cabins traveled fast, and by the time local papers picked it up, reporters from Knoxville and even as far as Atlanta were already rolling into town with cameras. The front page of the Jefferson Chronicle carried the headline, "Developer's dream sinks as lake drains overnight." Beneath it was a grainy photo of half-submerged cabins, their stilts twisted, roofs leaning like crooked teeth. The county sheriff's office had no choice but to get involved. Sheriff Paul Reeves, a man who had known Raymond since high school, drove out to the dam in person. He found Raymond leaning against his truck as if waiting. "Ray," the sheriff said quietly, "tell me straight, did you open those gates?" Raymond didn't hesitate. "Yes," the sheriff sighed, removing his hat. "You know what this means, don't you?" "I know what it means for the lake," Raymond replied. "The rest we'll see." The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "Corinna's already filed charges, sabotage, property damage. She's demanding we haul you in." Raymond looked toward the waterline, now lower, healthier, with reeds already sprouting where mud had surfaced. "Do what you have to do, Paul. I did what I had to do." The sheriff hesitated, torn between duty and loyalty. He finally muttered, "Get in the truck." By the time Raymond arrived at the county jail, reporters had gathered outside. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved at him as he walked past. "Mr. Holt, do you admit to destroying the cabins?" one asked. Another shouted, "Are you a hero or a criminal?" Raymond said nothing. His silence only deepened the divide inside the town. Battle lines hardened. Some people, especially those who had invested their savings or taken jobs with the project, were furious. At the Rusty Lantern Diner, Jeff McCormick slammed his fist on the table. "He stole food from my kids' mouths. Those cabins were going to put money in this town for years." Others, however, felt something different, relief. June Hart, the retired teacher's wife who had argued with her husband about the cabins, stood up in the diner and said firmly, "Raymond saved us. You think jobs matter if the land is poisoned? Look at that lake now, it's breathing again." Arguments turned into shouting matches. Friendships frayed. The project had already divided the county. Raymond's decision made the fracture permanent. Meanwhile, Corinna faced her own reckoning. The investors who once stood proudly at her side now flooded her phone with angry calls. One meeting in Knoxville turned ugly when a lawyer for one of the largest backers slammed a binder on the table. "You promised stability. You promised us return on investment, and you let some old man drain the very thing you built around. You'll be lucky if bankruptcy's the worst of it." Corinna tried to fight back, insisting the county should hold Raymond solely responsible. But in quieter moments, she couldn't avoid the truth. She had been warned repeatedly. Her arrogance had pushed the project past the point of no return. Back in Jefferson County, Raymond was released on bail after just 2 nights. The sheriff had spoken to the judge, arguing he wasn't a flight risk. When Raymond walked out, dozens of locals were waiting. Half of them clapped, the other half jeered. Some shook his hand. Others spat near his boots. One boy, Travis, rushed forward. "Ray, you did it." "The marsh is back already. I saw frogs where I haven't seen them in years." Raymond smiled faintly, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's what matters." But even as he spoke, he knew the storm was far from over. Lawsuits loomed. The county commission scheduled an emergency meeting, and Corinna was already making television appearances, painting him as reckless, dangerous, even unhinged. On the evening news, she appeared in a crisp blazer saying, "This wasn't restoration. This was destruction. One man cannot be allowed to hold an entire community hostage because he clings to outdated notions of ownership. We will seek justice." Raymond watched from his porch, sipping coffee. He shook his head slowly. To him, her words didn't matter anymore. The lake behind her told the real story. Water low, yes, but life already returning. The town, though, wasn't sure what story to believe. Some saw Raymond as a guardian. Others saw him as a villain. And in that uncertainty, the tension only deepened. But beneath all the arguments and lawsuits, a quieter question began to rise. Was this collapse really about one man's choice, or about a community blinded by promises it should never have trusted? The cabins never stood a chance. By winter, most of them had collapsed into the marsh, their frames twisted, decks buried in silt. A few remained upright but empty. No renters, no tourists, just hollow shells staring out at a lake that no longer wanted them. The brochures promising paradise had stopped circulating. The website advertising lakeshore cabins at Cherokee went dark. What had once been marketed as the county's future was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Corinna Duval spent those months in courtrooms and conference calls. The lawsuits came from every direction: investors, contractors, even the county itself. Each one drained her resources further. The woman who had once walked into Jefferson County with polished confidence was now described in the papers with harsher words: reckless, arrogant, careless. In private, she fought to salvage her reputation, but her empire had cracked just as fast as the cabins had. Raymond Holt, meanwhile, returned to his routine. Every morning he checked the dam, his boots crunching over frost as he leaned against the railing. The lake was lower than before, yes, but healthier. Reeds grew where cabins had once stood. Ducks returned in flocks, the kind he hadn't seen in years. Fishermen began talking about the base biting again, stronger, hungrier. Slowly the land was reclaiming itself. Not everyone forgave him. Some neighbors refused to speak when he passed them. At the hardware store he overheard men muttering, "That old fool ruined everything." But just as many people thanked him quietly: farmers who noticed their wells clearer, bird watchers who spotted herons back in the marsh, parents who told their children the story of the man who stood up for the lake. One evening, Travis came by with a notebook in hand. "Mr. Holt," he said shyly, "I've got to write an essay for school about someone I admire. I want to write about you." Raymond chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, I'm no hero. I just did what needed doing." "But everyone else was scared to," Travis insisted. "You weren't." That night, Raymond sat by the fire thinking about the boy's words. Maybe he wasn't a hero. Maybe he was just a stubborn old man who couldn't stand to see his family's work undone. But when he listened to the chorus of frogs outside, when he watched the water ripple naturally again, he felt peace. The town itself eventually adjusted. Some families moved away, chasing jobs elsewhere. Others stayed, finding new pride in the lake as it healed. Arguments still flared at the diner now and then, but they didn't last as long. People were tired of fighting, tired of choosing sides. The cabins became a landmark, a reminder that nature doesn't bend just because someone waves money at it. In his final interview with a local paper, Raymond said it plainly: "What happened here wasn't about me and Corinna. It was about the land teaching us a lesson we should have already known. You can't build forever without respecting what holds you up. You can't take and expect balance to stay." The reporter asked him if he regretted it, opening the dam, draining the lake, facing lawsuits and scorn. Raymond looked out at the waterline before answering, "Regret? No. My father used to say the lake isn't ours to keep, only ours to care for. I cared for it the only way I knew how." Those words spread further than he expected, not just in Jefferson County but in neighboring towns, then across the state. Some still called him reckless, but others began to use his name alongside words like protector and steward. To him, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the lake was alive. The cabins sank. The brochures rotted. The lawsuits dragged on. But the water kept moving, steady and sure, just as it always had when his grandfather first laid the stones. And maybe that was the truest lesson of all, that nature always gets the final word. So when you think about your own choices, big or small, remember this story. Remember Raymond, standing at that dam, choosing to act when no one else would. Ask yourself, are you chasing profit or are you protecting balance? Because one lasts a season, the other lasts a lifetime. If you believe in stories that remind us of respect, for land, for legacy, for doing what's right even when it costs, then make sure to subscribe. More stories are waiting, and each one carries a lesson worth holding on to.